Today is Wednesday. It is Yud Gimel Tevis, Tavshayin Gimel, and we are in Sefer HaMamorim, Teres Menachem Sefer HaMamorim Tavshayin Aleph Tavshayin Yud Beis, in the middle of the Mamar of Purim Vekibel Hayehudim, and we're on page Mem Hey, and we're up to Ois Tes, chapter 9. We discussed up until this point the three aspects that exist in mitzvahs and the three aspects that correspondingly exist in Torah. To use the terms that we use in the Maimer, there's the Tachtein, there's the Elyon, and then there's the power that's greater than the two. There's the low aspect, there's the high aspect, and then there's the one that's beyond them both. In mitzvahs, the low aspect is the fulfillment of mitzvahs by rote, mitzvahs anoshim ulamoda. The higher aspect is to fulfill the mitzvah in order to connect to Hashem. And the one that's greater than the two is the fulfillment of mitzvahs purely and simply because it's God's will. In Torah, the low aspect is learning Torah for the purpose of knowing what we need to do in our daily lives, how we need to conduct ourselves. The high aspect is learning Torah for the purpose of knowing Torah. And the one that's greater than the two is toiling in Torah day and night. In the common denominator between the first two as opposed to the third, in other words, the common denominator between the Tachtein and the Elyon, as opposed to the one that's greater than both of them, both in mitzvahs and in Torah, is that in the former two, the focus is on the person. In the lower way of performing the mitzvah or learning Torah, the focus is on a low dimension of the person, either his body or his nature or his nefesh habahamis. In the higher way of the performance of mitzvahs or learning Torah, the focus is on the neshama of the person, the spiritual aspect of the person. When we talk about the third dimension, the one that's greater than the two, we're talking about something where the focus is not the person at all. It's the annulment of the person's characteristics. Focusing on something which is out of him, beyond him. However, both in mitzvahs and in Torah, when we talk about the highest level, as we just described, there is still some element of the person involved, some focus on the person. Why? Because a mitzvah, what is a mitzvah? It is an instruction to the person to behave in a certain way, to do something, or to refrain from doing something. So, necessarily, if there's an instruction to someone, that someone must exist. Similarly, in Torah, when we talk about v'hagisa b'yom v'layla, the highest way of learning Torah, as explained up to this point, we're talking about what? You should toil in Torah day and night. Again, there's an instruction. In Torah, there's an element. Good morning. In Torah, there's an element which supersedes the highest method, the highest aspect of mitzvahs and of Torah, as explained up to this point, and that is learning Torah lishma, learning Torah for the purpose and for the sake of learning Torah itself. When we learn Torah in that way, it goes beyond all limitations, it goes beyond all focus on the self. It's completely and totally dedicated to the Torah. Yes, there is a human being that learns Torah, but it's not as a result of any instruction, it's not as a result of any motive to know, or rather for any means to know how one should behave or to acquire knowledge. It's not even to fulfill the instruction of toiling in Torah day and night.
Is that bittul? Is that what you're going to say?
Correct. Bittul. That's what we learned up to this point. So over here we're talking about layers and layers, or levels and levels of bittul, going from in ascending order, from the lower to the higher. The key point that Rebbe is trying to make in this Maimer is that Matan Torah needed to permeate the very lowest levels. The purpose of Matan Torah is the combination, as we said, of the upper and the lower. The lower meaning the lowest. And that'll be the focus of chapter 9. The Rebbe over here says, before we go into the actual text, I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit, and perhaps we will be able to put this into some kind of a context so we can understand what I was trying to say here. It's a subtle point, and the point is this. Let's go back to the moshel. Morning. Let's go back to the moshel of mitzvahs. Let's go back to these three dimensions of mitzvahs. Let me try it from a different angle. We're talking about a tachtin, the low one, and we're talking about an elyon, the high one. In other words, we're talking in mitzvahs, for example, we're talking about gashmias and ruchnias. We're talking about something physical and something spiritual, something mundane and something holy. How do we combine these two factors that have no connection between each other inherently, naturally have no connection between each other? How do you combine two elements that not only don't have any connection, but are, in a sense, opposites? So what are we saying? We're talking about bittul. The key phrase, the key word, the operative word that we keep on hearing again and again is bittul. Right? Bittul. How do you fuse the two? How do you introduce into these two dimensions something which is beyond both of them? What does that force that's beyond both of them accomplish? It shrinks, it reduces the particular characteristics of the object. We go to the moshel of the Malachim, Michal and Gavriel, if you remember. Michal is water, Gavriel is fire, the host of water, the host of fire. Why do they not extinguish one another? Because what do they feel? They feel the overwhelming power of Hashem, of God Himself. And that they are messengers of God. So what does that do? It dulls the fire aspect of Gavriel. It dulls the water aspect of Michal. Right? So in other words, what am I doing over here? When I'm taking an object, when I'm doing a mitzvah, what's the idea? The idea is that I should take the physical object and it should lose its specific characteristics, to be mevatel, to cut away on those factors that oppose something holy to be fused with it, something spiritual to be fused with it? Or is the idea, or let me put it in another way, is the idea to lift it, to make it higher? In other words, is the idea to turn the object into something spiritual, something holy? No. The idea ultimately is that the object should remain in its specific characteristics. And in the world of its own specific characteristics, in that world it should be fused with something which is higher. Similarly, when we talk about the Elyon, we're not talking the higher one, we're not talking about taking something which is higher and turning it into something that's lower. We want it to remain in its high state. And in that state, it should fuse with something, with the tachter, with the low one.
Could I make a suggestion? Sounds a very simple physical example is glue. Glue sticks to two things that wouldn't stay together, brings them together. It doesn't change their essential nature. But
Here's what type of glue.
The difference is
it's
that
got to have some connection to both sides.
okay, but the problem with that is that the glue is in the middle, and what is on and the two materials, or the two things that are being stuck together, remain in their own world, so to speak. They remain as they were. They're just now connected together. Here we're talking about something else. We're talking about the two objects being intertwined, permeating each other, becoming one. Not just connected, but becoming one. Fusing. Right? Now, if we say, for example, that through iskafia and ishapcha, through working with the body and through working with the nefesh habahamis, what happens? Do we take the Nefesh Abamis and we turn him into a Nefesh Alekis? Or the Nefesh Abamis remains in its characteristics, and in there and through it, we now activate all those great things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted us to bring down into this world. In other words, God desired to have a dwelling place down here in this world. What does that mean? He wanted us to take this physical world and lift it into a higher world? Or he wanted the world to remain in its particular character? And there, and through there, in there, to reveal Göttlichkeit at the highest level. Similarly, when we say the Eibishter, Hashem desired to draw down godliness into this world, what does that mean? That we shrink down the Göttlichkeit, the godliness, to such an extent that the world is able to handle it? Or do we take the highest levels of godliness, and ultimately the very essence of Hashem, and bring it down into the world? It's the latter, obviously. So
it's not so obvious, because if you're saying really with Michal and Gabriel that they have also Shalom Bimra here, but still we know in this world,
there's fire
at
and
the
water.
same time you still have the opposites in this world.
Correct. Correct. So over there you have the point where it's Oisa Shalom Bimreimov.
Yeah.
God wants the mirror image of that down here. And that Nikuda, that point of not dulling the senses of the Tachtin, and similarly not reducing the potency of the Elyon, that you have mostly, that is revealed in the idea of learning Torah Lishma, where the person remains a human being, full-fledged human being, as he is, in his limitations, and nevertheless you have an element of blikvul, of limitlessness, that fuses together with the person. That you have in Torah Lishma. That's the point that it makes over here. Because what's the idea ultimately, as we discussed at the very tail end of, I think, yesterday's show, two days ago? It's not that we should become angels. It's not that we should become spiritual beings. We should remain human beings in a physical world. And in that physical world, to draw down the very highest and greatest levels of godliness, to the extent that we draw down the very essence of Hashem in this physical world. So the physical world, the human being remains in his specific characteristics. What's going to be when Mashiach comes? When Mashiach comes, the physical world is going to turn into Atzilus, or Eres of Shalifnei Atzimtzum, God's infinite light before the Tzimtzum. No. It'll be a physical low world as we know it now, in its physical characteristics, and in its physical characteristics, and through its physical characteristics, it will reveal the very essence of Hashem. That's the meaning of Dira B'Tachtenim, a dwelling place for Hashem in this world.
And therefore, those three levels you were talking about, they still operate, and they're all operating at the same time. One does. They're not sequential in a way. They are sequential. We have to go from one to the other. They will still continue to.
Well, you say if you're talking about sequential, in the sense that they're certainly sequential in terms of levels. One is higher and one is lower. Which one comes first or which one comes second?
In time, they're not sequential. You operate on all three at the same time.
Levels, and even beyond that. And that's the point that Rebbe is making here. Let's see how the Rebbe tries. Let's try to see how the Rebbe spells it out in Tess. V'yesh Shleima, page Mem 8, chapter 9. V'yesh Shleima we could say, Sha'achibur del yenim v'tachtenim shenischadesh b'matan Torah hu mizgala be'ikir b'lim v'datera d'shma. The Rebbe says we could say that the fusion of the elyonim, the upper ones, the tachtenim and the lower ones, that was the innovation of Matan Torah that took place at Sinai, is mainly revealed in the learning of Torah Lishma, in learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah. Even beyond, if you remember the Shiur from yesterday, even beyond the learning of Torah in the form of V'hagisa, toiling in Torah day and night. This idea of fusing the upper and the lower is mainly revealed in the learning of Torah for the sake of learning Torah itself. Why? The neus of al zeh shebichdei sheyuchal yisachibra d'elyonim tachtenim hu alidei bitla gather d'elyonim v'tachten alidei hamshachas shel ma'al mishnayim. It's a bit of a mouthful, but this is what the Rebbe is saying. In addition to the fact that in order for there to be able to be the combination of the higher ones with the lower ones, there must be this takes place and is carried out through the nullification of the characteristics of the higher one and the lower one. How? By drawing down a God's infinite light, which is a force greater than the two. That's in a nutshell, wrapping up everything that was said until now. Shedugmasoi kanal sivdalad, as we've explained in Ois 4, in Sif 4, in chapter 4. Shedugmasoi ba'adam. How does that work out in the person? That's in a mitzvah. How does it work out in the person? That happens when a person learns Torah for the sake of learning Torah. Then he is in a state of nullification of his being. Both in connection to his body, the low aspect of the person. And also in connection to his soul, the upper aspect of the person. In addition to that, here we're talking about bittul. In addition to that, in addition to that, also the fusion of the upper ones and the lower ones itself is revealed in this learning. Why? How? The Torah, which is Elyonim, the limitlessness of Torah, which represents the upper realm, the upper aspect. This affects the person, which is the low aspect. It affects the person that is learning of Torah should be beyond limitation. Right? So in other words, in addition to the fact that, as we said before, what's the point? In order for there to be able to be the fusion of the two, it's by removing the differentiating characteristics of the Elyon and the Tachton. There's an additional element over here. The combination of the two. So in other words, not only the removal of their differentiation, in one word, not only the bittul is expressed mostly through learning Torah Lishma, the chibur, the fusion, is also mostly expressed through learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah. Why? Because when you learn Torah for the sake of learning Torah, what do you have over here? You have full-blown Elyon, Torah at its highest level, and a full-blown Tachton, the person. And they fuse together to such an extent that it is the person, the Tachton, who is operating in the most Elyon way possible. Now the Rebbe goes on a step further. Based on this, we can add through the fact that the limitlessness of Torah affects also the person. In other words, the person as a human being, as he is a person, not that it removes it turns the person into it doesn't turn the person into an angel. The fact is that Torah, when you learn Torah Lishma, Torah for the sake of learning Torah, it affects the person in his realm, in his world, right? And similarly, to the Torah descending down here in general, where Torah permeates the low world in its own state, through this, this reveals the limitlessness of Torah even more. That what? The fact that Torah is limitless, what is revealed is that the limitlessness of Torah is not only in the place and in the level of Torah, in the world of Torah. Torah is also able to come down and to be drawn down here. And not only is it able to be drawn down here into the lower realm, but how does it come down? Not that its potency is reduced, it's shrunk. And also as it comes down here, as it's drawn down here, the limitlessness of Torah is also felt and is retained. To the extent that the learning of the Torah of the person is also in a limitless way. If you remember, many shiurim ago we discussed the idea of limitlessness. There are levels in limitlessness. When you say a billion, one relative to a billion, one number relative to 1 billion, very, very big gap between the two, but it's not limitless. If you count long enough, you'll get to 1 billion. If you say infinite numbers relative to 1, That's limitless. You can count as long as you want. You'll never get to infinity. But they are related to one another in the sense that they're both numbers. They're both in the world of numbers. Infinity and one are in the world of numbers. Infinite numbers and one number are still in the world of numbers. Then you have true infiniteness, true limitlessness. Something which is beyond numbers. It's everything. God. What's the relationship between number one and God? Really, really limitless. That's true limitlessness, right? So when you say Torah, Torah is limitless. So you could look at Torah in the world of Torah, and you say Torah in its own world is limitless. It has no end. In fact, as we discussed earlier, even Torah as we know it is truly limitless. Because you can keep on delving deeper and deeper and deeper, and it doesn't end. But that's Torah. Now, when Torah comes into contact with something else, Torah and the person, for example, is it limitless only in its own world? Or even when it goes outside of its world? In other words, is Torah limited only to Torah? Or is the limitlessness of Torah truly limitless? The answer is it's the latter. And therefore, when it comes in contact with the human being, when the person learns Torah, there is a way for Torah to be learned by the human being. There is a way for Torah to express itself, even within the human being and through the human being in a limitless way. Where is that? That's in learning Torah Lishma. Learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah. Because if you remember, learning Torah for the purpose of knowing how to behave in our daily lives as Jews, that's limited. There's 613 mitzvahs. Learning Torah for the sake of knowing Torah, that's also limited. It is possible, at least in width, to know the entire Torah, to cover the entire Torah. As we discussed, the Rambam says if you learn the 5 books of Moses and the Mishnah Torah the Rambam, you basically cover the entire Torah. There's other ways that learn the Alter Rebbe says you could learn the Rosh and other books, which will basically give you, and with that you will fulfill your obligation of knowing the entire Torah. Then there is the idea higher to learn Torah, not for the sake of knowing how to behave, not for the sake of learning to acquire knowledge in Torah. There's a way to learn Torah, there's an obligation to learn Torah as much as one possibly can. Day and night. That's also limited. Why? Because there are certain exclusions, as the Alter Rebbe says in Hilchos Talmud Torah, as is elaborated upon in the laws of learning Torah. But when you learn Torah Lishma, when a person is so totally committed to learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah, and for no other reason, then, to the extent that limitlessness is possible to express itself in the finiteness of a human being, you have it. It'll permeate every aspect of a human being's existence, irrespective of any constraints that one might have otherwise. Of course, you only have 24 hours a day, so you're limited in that sense. But to the extent that limitlessness could express itself in a human being, that you'll find in Torah Lishma, learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah. So when you have on the one hand a human being who is limited, and to the extent possible, within those constraints, limitlessness expresses itself when the person learns Torah Lishma, that brings out the true limitlessness of Torah. That it's not only limited to its own world, to the world of Torah, but Torah, when it comes in contact with the human being, and by definition, when it comes in contact with the world, is really and truly unlimited, really and truly limitless. And where do you have this expression mainly? It's not that if the Torah would take the person and turn him into an angel or turn him into a spiritual being, that doesn't show the limitlessness of Torah. On the contrary, that would say that Torah needs something higher, a higher being, in order to express its limitlessness. The fact that the human being remains a human being in his limitations, in the defining characteristics of a human being, and the human being in his world combines with Torah to such an extent that he's able to learn Torah Lishma for the sake of learning Torah, which removes all the limitations of the 3 previous levels of learning Torah, to know how to behave for the sake of acquiring knowledge in Torah, toiling in Torah day and night. All of those have defining characteristics. Learning Torah Lishma means I'm completely and totally dedicated to learning Torah, irrespective of any possible limitations that exist in my life. That expresses the ultimate limitlessness of Torah. And that is, as I mentioned, true bligvul, true limitlessness. That it's not only limited in its own world, it's not infinite numbers relative to number one, but it's true limitlessness beyond everything. And it's this point, as the Rebbe is going to explain later on, that was necessary. The actualization of this idea was necessary in order to bring Matan Torah to its fullness and to its full expression. And that's what happened at Purim. And that's what happened through Mordechai. And that's why the Rebbe is going to say at the end, Purim ultimately is celebrated how? Chayev inish l'psumim v'pura ada leyada. Person has to celebrate Purim until he goes out of his limitations. Right? How? Through eating and drinking. So you have the fusion of the two. Lipsumah. You have to get to that level through the Gashmias, through the physical. Why? Because we're talking about what? Taking the ultimate blikvul, the ultimate limitlessness, and that finding expression in something which is limited, finite, in the human being. Not to turn us into angels, but to be human beings to our fullest potential and fuse it with the highest levels of Gedlichkeit.